So on the issue of sexual violence and conflict, I actually think that it's a little bit of both, and that neither answer is going to be particularly satisfying, which is to say that on one hand, there has been a lot more attention paid to sexual violence and conflict, as we've seen in the Congo, as we've seen with prosecutions at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And all of those prosecutions have been after the fact. So then when you get to the question of prevention, you have to ask yourself, how much are we really preventing? Well, as a human rights activist, I have to believe that the prosecution of sexual violence in conflict leads to future prevention, as well as strengthens accountability in the current system.
I'm sorry, this is going to get worse. I'm hearing the siren, hoping he was turning the other way.
Yeah, I didn't hear it at all.
Always a challenge shooting in the sea. Okay. You were doing great, though.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, please talk a little bit about any change you've seen.
Sure. So generally, I think there's been a tremendous improvement with regard to publication and to kind of general dissemination of information about sexual violence. I mean, I think everyone's still horrified when we hear the numbers of women who are raped. It would seem almost on a daily basis in places like the Congo. So in some ways it's been generalized. People are still horrified. People know that there's lots of sexual violence and conflict. What I think is missing, though, in terms of the prevention element is that a kind of deeper examination structurally and within society about why it is in whatever armed conflict you have, women are at risk in the first place. And I think the progress that needs to be made really has to do with changing the treatment of women in times of peace. I've written something on this actually, that women are at risk for sexual and other violence in times of conflict, in part because they're already subordinated in times of peace. So dealing with women's status before there's a conflict will undoubtedly improve what happens to them during times of conflict, as well as obviously ensuring that there's investigation and prosecution afterwards. I guess the second point I want to make is that there's a general issue that pervades a lot of women's rights work that isn't always brought to the fore, which is about women's sexual autonomy and sex, period, in any given society. So the reason that sexual violence and conflict is so effective in some ways is because the issue of sex in communities is still so weighted, so freighted, you know, the issue of sex, period, and then what happens to women sexually. It becomes a very easy tactic, I think, for a lot of armies or a lot of practitioners of war, because women's sexuality is something that's very guarded and commented upon by their own communities. It makes women too easy targets in times of war. So that has to change in order for us to have actually more accountability and prevention in times of conflict.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about rape being used as a weapon of war.
Well, we've seen in Haiti, we've seen for the former Yugoslavia, we've seen in Congo.
You could just start again.
In terms of rape as a weapon of war, we've seen in a lot of recent conflicts, including the former Yugoslavia, Haiti, Rwanda, Congo, that women are very easy targets for sexual violence as a way to both harm women directly, and I think we can never lose sight of that, but also as a way of, as a kind of political tactic, as a way of emasculating communities, as a way of showing kind of absolute power to take the women and the kids. And it's unfortunately extremely common now. And, you know, it was not uncommon, even though we hadn't heard about it in a lot of the earlier wars, including World War II, including the Vietnam War, you know, that the U.S. was involved in. Almost all great wars around the world have involved targeting women for sexual violence. Perhaps not as a clear strategy as it has emerged recently, but certainly as what was then considered a byproduct of war, but was never really a byproduct of war, was always an exercise of power and an exercise of the victors over the vanquished.
Talk about some of the cross-cultural aspects of violence against women that you have observed.
Well, I think some of the cross-cultural aspects have to do with complicity, which is to say whether you're talking about sexual violence or more routine types of violence, domestic violence, that you have a certain societal complicity. and a certain need by some. And I think it's very important to note that it's by some and not by all, because there's a whole, there are legions of women's rights activists around the world working to counter this and to say, I'm a part of this culture and this society too, and I don't believe this and I don't want this. But nevertheless, there's a lot of societal and local complicity with regard to women staying silent in the face of being battered in the home by an intimate partner, or in the face of being raped or otherwise sexually assaulted by a stranger or a near stranger in the street. So some commonalities have to do with silence, with women feeling guilty and to blame about what has happened to them, and commonalities with regard to the treatment by the judicial system, which has changed quite a bit, but where there's still a lot of trepidation by individual victims of assault to go before judges and prosecutors and to claim their rights and to say, this is what has happened to me and this is why I deserve redress. There are a lot of obstacles put in the way of women, and we see that kind of the universality of those obstacles, and it's obviously extremely unfortunate and something that women's rights activists have been trying to chip away at, depending upon the country they're in, for 40 years now, if not longer.
Mm-hmm. You've also participated in the UN Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. Now we have the birth of UN Women. How would you evaluate the progress that's been made since Beijing, and do you believe there's been a paradigm shift in global attitudes towards women since then?
Whether there's been a paradigm shift in global attitudes toward women since then? Yes and no. So the idea of UN Women, so this superstructure at the UN that's going to kind of bring into a concentrated way all of the different efforts of the UN on women's rights, is a really great idea. And it's especially a good idea because now the former president of Chile is going to head it. And we presume, based on her previous work and her commitment to women's rights, that she will be a very strong leader and a strong political force within the UN, which is almost always what one needs there. So between Beijing and the creation of UN Women, I think there's been kind of a sea change with regard to activism, which is that wherever you go around the world, you're going to find some number of women who are committed to the universality of women's rights. That is no longer an alien concept, though there are many people in the world, in the UN system and otherwise, who would like you and me to believe that it's an isolated Western phenomenon that has nothing to do with me, wherever I am. What we know, in fact, is that women are working individually and collectively around the world to ensure that their lives and the lives of their families are lived with dignity, and that part of the assessment of the well-being of their countries and individual women is kind of these kind of basic freedoms that are outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights instruments. So I do think there's been a sea change with regard to finding more like-minded people willing to put their lives on the line to defend their rights and the rights of others. I do think, on the other hand, that there is a kind of persistent and dangerous elements of cultural relativism that just kind of nag us, and that it just won't go away. I don't know how to explain it. Which is to say that there are always elements in different societies, including in the United States of America, that try to cast women's rights as being not just foreign, but antithetical to nationalism, antithetical to the well-being of countries. And it's pernicious, and it just seems never to disappear. It's always there in one form or another. I think that the language changes, but the underlying sentiment does not, which is that this is somehow not specific to us, and you can't really look at women's rights and think about, what they indicate about the larger country and the larger well-being of the country. And that's extremely unfortunate. And again, it's something we work against, and in my work at the Ford Foundation, that we try to fund challenges to that, to those attacks every day.
Mm-hmm. You've also worked with a coalition of women's rights activists to urge Congress to pass the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000. How was this coalition formed, and what were the challenges or benefits to working with a coalition to fight this issue?
Sure. So we worked in coalition with the Trafficking Act that was passed in 2000. There were several groups here in Washington that were women's rights groups, human rights groups, and trafficking groups. And in part, the organization for which I worked at the time had done quite a bit of work on trafficking of women into sex work. We thought that it was very important, actually, given that there is the trafficking protocol, in fact, to make sure that governments understood the true nature of trafficking, which was that it was less about the work, in this instance sex work, and more about the conditions of the work and the conditions in which women were duped or tricked into migrating for work. We thought that it was important, obviously, because there are millions of women every year who are trafficked for sex work as well as domestic work and end up in virtual slavery. We thought that the United States government needed to play more of an active role in being a leader, actually, on this issue and ensuring that trafficking was dealt with internally and internationally, and that there were better international standards on this. The benefits of working in coalition is that you get smarter, which is to say you end up working with people who know more than you do on different areas, and together you bring together a level of expertise that you obviously can't have individually. It also shows the government that there is a group of like-minded people who are willing to exert, concerted efforts to highlight an issue and bring about positive legislation. So the benefits of the coalition work were that, again, we work with people who are smarter than we are, and we get better and we learn more in the process. And the final legislation, the final effort, is actually a stronger piece because you have more people involved and a more informed piece.
This organization, Women's Learning Partnerships, is in the process of continuously celebrating its 10th anniversary.
Yes.
Is there any, what value do you see that they bring to your work in general?
First of all, I can't believe it's only been 10 years. When I think of Women's Learning Partnership, I think it must be 30 years old or so, but I'm surprised then to learn that it's only 10 years old. There is a connection with Muslim-dominated countries, or countries in which there's a significant number of Muslim citizens, that I think is a very important contribution. Being able to kind of connect women across regions and across countries, and to have, again, a regional effort, I think is extremely important. Using communications and media as a tool of activism is extremely important. The contribution that they make on advocacy and demystifying advocacy, I think, is extremely important. So much of what happens, I think, in the Muslim world is represented by others and is not an articulation of values and ideas by Muslim women themselves. And I think there's a real value to having Muslim women not exoticized and seen as mainstream, and seen as not taking part in something that women from the United States and others have begun, but forming their own independent movement and own independent contributions, and taking the lead on certain issues that very much affect women in Muslim-dominated countries and communities. So I think the Women's Learning Partnership is obviously invaluable, and look forward to another 30 years at least.
30, okay.
Yeah.
Any strategies that you can offer to other groups working against this issue around the world?
Against the issue of rape and conflict?
Yes,
or the subordination of women generally?
Yes.
Which we all, well, I won't make anything gratuitous comments about that. I actually believe that one of the most important strategies is rights education, which is to say, rights cannot be a theoretical concept that we read about in law school books, and they can't be a theoretical concept that we read about in the Universal Declaration or any of the UN conventions. In order for it to mean something to individual women, it has to improve their lives, and they have to be able to kind of grab it and take hold of it. So what is it that we do as activists to make sure that women can actually exercise their rights? And some of that is kind of direct rights education with women who have been victims of crimes or violence. Others is rights education with government officials so that they actually know what their jobs are and how they should be honoring the law. So rights education is one component of it. I think that issues of communication and strategizing across nations and communities is extremely important, because I think we live in a world in which, at least on the face of it, there's so much that divides us, and that some people would really like to think divides us, and yet I still go to bed every night believing there's more that unites us than divides us. So how do we find commonality of purpose? And so unifying across regions, I think, is extremely important. How do you get former rape victims in Rwanda to actually be very engaged in the question of stoning? And how are they related? Because they actually are related. So how do we find a commonality of purpose so that we aren't in each of our silos of human rights abuses? I think there has to be broad strategizing with other movements that are outside of the women's rights movement, which is to say that I think there might be a tendency to self-isolate, which is to say that women's rights activists perhaps think that other people don't understand the nature of the abuses, and yet I think the LGBTQI movement offers a lot of real possibilities. Movements that are about racial justice and caste-based discrimination offer a lot of possibilities because all of these systems are based on subordination and inequality. And if we can remember that, then we have the possibility of doing alliance building and real strategizing about how to counter governments and other forces in a more collective way, and that our voices become the majority, that we stop seeing ourselves, in fact, as a minority and start to see ourselves as a majority.